Hey everyone, I'm Madison with Health by Ratio, and welcome to this week's vlog episode where we're going to be continuing on the conversation on how to functionally exercise your body, how to work out and keep your body healthy while you're improving your strength and your cardio and your endurance, or just getting in generally better shape. So if you haven't already, we're going to be following along with this video with our free ebook, The Ultimate Workout Guide. If you haven't already gotten that, feel free to click the link just above this video so that you can get your own copy and follow along. And today we're going to be covering all the exercises that pertain to our core. Now, just to preface this a little bit, your core is technically anything that's between your hips and your shoulders, basically. So core exercises also can be glute-specific exercises or back-related exercises, but for those, we kind of covered more of our glute-pertaining exercises in the lower body portion from last week's episode, and the back exercises we're going to cover more in next week's episode when we're going over upper body and full body techniques. So today, when we're talking about core, even though there's like things like deadlifts or things like rows could be considered a core exercise, we're going to be sticking to kind of your typical rectus abdominis, internal external obliques, transverse abdominis, basically anything that is going to be engaging these abdominal muscles that we consider. Okay, so getting into this, we're going to be talking about the most important exercises that we want to be doing on a regular basis, as well as the exercises that we want to do a little less frequently. So kind of the ratio of this would be about 2/3 of our time on the good focus exercises, that's how much energy we're putting toward them, and about 1/3 of our time and energy should go toward the other types of exercises. And this is the difference between some of our clients who were living with chronic pain, specifically around the lower back and thoracic spine regions, that were also impacting their hip and lower body health as well. Clients of ours like Marissa, who was dealing with degenerative disc disease. She was a triathlete and kind of a weekend warrior triathlete, I would say. So she liked to sign up for 3 or 4 races a year, but would often have to bail out in the midst of her training when she had setbacks with her back and also a couple of other areas with her body. And one of the things that she was told was, you have a weak core. You need to engage your core. Her physio said, like, let's maybe introduce some Pilates work in strengthening your core. How often have we been told that, right? You need to strengthen your core is not firing well, let's work on that core. Well, for Marissa, this was her story, and they recommended Pilates for her. Well, it turned out that some of the main imbalances that were happening in her body happened to be stemming from her hip flexors and her shoulder girdle, and kind of a compressed thoracic spine, compressed shoulder girdle, and an imbalance in her hips that were rotating her forward. We talked about this a bit in last week's episode, but really impacting the lower back. And Pilates, even though it's a great form of exercise and can challenge you in some great ranges of motion, but it happens to be very hip flexor and shoulder dominant. There's a lot of pikes in it, there's a lot of leg lifts in it, there's a lot of V holds in it, there's a lot of things that, even though they engage your core, they also tighten up and engage your hip flexors, which for her was overactive. So by her training her core to get quote-unquote stronger, she was actually pulling her hips further and further out of balance, and she was finding that even though her core was looking lean and toned and she felt stronger in it, that her back was feeling much, much worse despite her activating that core. And that was because of the choices of exercises that she was doing more frequently than the ones she probably should have. So when we got her started on her program, we were able to activate her core in a functional way that was applicable to how she was running and swimming and biking and also exercising and moving throughout her day with her kids, all that jazz. So it was much more functional while also keeping her body balanced so that her hips weren't pulling her out of alignment. So that's just one example. We're going to talk about some others as we go, but I want to get into the meat and potatoes of this. So let's get started with some of our exercises. The very first one that we're going to cover, and again, this is if you scroll into your ebook, and I'm following along on my laptop here, you're going to see our first 2 exercises are banded or cable anti-rotations and banded cable or medicine ball wood chops. So I'm going to cover both of these at the same time because they have a lot to do with each other. And actually our third exercise, which is half kneeling cable and band chops, I'll cover right at the end. They all kind of sync together. They're complements of one another. So I'm going to start with banded wood chops and then go into the anti-rotations right after. So the banded wood chops, and you can do these with cables, you can do them with obviously resistance bands, you can do these with a medicine ball if you wanted to kind of go more from a freestanding position. But essentially what we're doing with bands or a cable is we're having this attached from the side angle from us, and this could be at hip height, shoulder height, above head, below head. We could change up the angles to make this more of a decline, more straight on, more of an incline. All of them are great, but all of them are going to stem with the same rules. You're going to have both hands holding onto your band with your sternum pointed in the same direction as your hands, with a good soft bend in your knees. We're going to rotate our entire body by focusing on engaging that core. You're going to feel this more on the sides, the oblique muscles themselves, while keeping the shoulder blades pinched back and the arms straight the whole time. What we don't want to see is us move the arms without the chest or shoulders. We want this to stem from an entire torso movement, and we also don't want to round the shoulders forward here. So we don't want to be shrugged forward as we're rolling. We want to be pinched back and have a good solid position as we're doing it. The last thing that we kind of want to pay attention to is often we can get into some more aggressive tensions on the lower back. So if you have some lower back pain, you might want to tune into this. When we over rotate, so in a wood chop, you do not need to move 180 degrees. When we go this far, we often will start getting a little bit of tension in and around the vertebrae. Instead, we kind of want to limit this to an angle to an angle. So we're limiting this to 90 degrees total, kind of like 45 degrees to my right, 45 degrees to my left. And what that causes is for me to have constant tension on my core at all times, which is more difficult, but also much safer on the lower back to wake up those obliques. So that's our wood chop. We can do this in a neutral stance. We can do this in a staggered stance. We could do this obviously with the other foot forward. We could do this in a lunge position, out of a squat position. There's a million ways to change up wood chops. They're all really great. I encourage you to incorporate them frequently in your workouts. Now, anti-rotations are an easy complement to it that are essentially like a wood chop meets a plank. So if you think of a plank where you're just freezing yourself in position, that's what an anti-rotation is, where I'm getting into the same position as if I was doing a wood chop, but instead this time I'm just going to extend my arms straight out in front of me and hold it. So I'm literally fighting this band from wanting to pull me into rotation, hence anti-rotation. So cables would work the same, or resistance band, but I can move in and out of these presses to increase the tension or decrease the tension and give myself some breaks, or I can just hold this constant the entire time. But again, same rule of thumb as when we're doing this with a wood chop. We don't want to be rolled forward. We want to be pinched back with those shoulders, with the arms straight, and that the hands are in line with the sternum. Almost think about these two as if there was a meter stick from your chest to your hands, and you have to keep that same angle from your palms to your chest, your sternum, at all times. Okay? So those are our first two versions, and again, just like with wood chops, anti-rotations you can do with all different foot positions. So you can hold this with a staggered stance, you could hold this in a lunge position, you could go from a squat and go into anti-rotations. There's a lot of variations. Now, the third one, half kneeling wood chop, is kind of a combination of the two. And this exercise is incredibly functional. It wakes up those internal and external obliques again. It also incorporates the upper body a little bit. And I think it was made famous by Gray Cook. So what you typically are going to do is attach a resistance band or cable at an above head position. Then we're going to take a knee. You can do this with the inside knee up or outside knee up. Either version is fine. And all we're going to do is keep the torso pointed dead sideways, and we're going to go from my arms straight toward the anchor point to my arms now straight down away from it. So I'm pulling it across my body, straightening out this arm here and pinching my shoulder back while keeping that core dead stable. So it's very similar to an anti-rotation move. I'm just getting the movement from my arms while my core is staying stable. All these are incredibly functional to stabilize that core, because if you think about it, we all know this, we don't want to move throughout our day in a bunch of flexion here. Even though Crunches can be a great exercise to get those abs. That's not really functional, right? We don't want to pick things up with a rounded back. So going into spinal flexion, kind of counterintuitive, especially if you're sitting throughout the day, and as you're sitting, you're in this kind of rounded, bad postural position. All of these things compress the spine, getting us into flexion. What we really want the core to be able to do is stay stable, and instead, when we move, we want it to stem from either our hips, or we want the range of motion to come from our thoracic spine. So we want the mobility to come from the thoracic spine, shoulder girdle, or the hips. We want to train the core to stay solid and stable, hence why these exercises are priorities. Now moving on, our next exercise is called an anti-extension. Anti-extensions have quite a few different variations to them. The most probably common one that people have seen, but it's also one of the most difficult, is rollouts. So that would be with like an ab wheel, or you could do this on a slide board with like gliders on your hands. You don't even need a slide board technically. You could do this on a hardwood floor just with 2 towels underneath your hands to get kind of slippery. But what you'd be doing is sliding your hands out and then pulling them back in. And normally we do them off your knees. If you're a freak and you're able to do them off your feet, knock yourself out. You probably don't need to be watching this video because you're probably pretty stinking advanced. But with regards to an anti-extension in this format, as your arms go up, the whole goal is to try to keep your hips completely level and then pull back in. Now, obviously, you're not walking out the way I did. You'd normally be just smoothly gliding, but you get the picture. And the reason why it's called an anti-extension is because the direction you want as you go further and further out in front of you, the tendency is for us to want to dip and arch our back. So dip the hips down to the ground and arch the back. That's not what we want. We don't want to go into that extension position as we're going into this, hence anti-extensions. So that is the more aggressive version of this exercise. But an easier version you can do is with a resistance band or a super band connected at about head level or above. And what we're gonna do is grab a hold of our resistance band, hold it overhead kind of a little bit out in front of us with our arms straight, get shoulder width apart, toes pointed forward, and all we're gonna do is go into a straight leg deadlift position. So we're hip hinging here, keeping the back flat, and then we're gonna let this band pull us upright with its own momentum. But at the last second, we're gonna engage that core to stop us from extending too far over, so to stop us from arching that lower back. So this momentum is getting pulled, is causing from being pulled from the resistance band overhead, and at that last second, that firing is what's engaging us into anti-extensions, which is really important. And one of the main exercises that we use to retrain the way Marissa, degenerative disc disease triathlete, functioned with her core, because her big issue was having super overactive hip flexors, sitting throughout the day, whether she was driving and picking up the kids, working, also the countless hours on her bike. All of these things are engaging and shortening the hip flexors, which was pulling her into this low lumbo-pelvic imbalance called an anterior pelvic tilt. Basically, your belt buckle is sloped down to the ground. Well, that is causing your back to get put into an overextended position. So for her, when she was doing her functional movements throughout the day, she was causing her core wasn't engaging the right way. She was getting put into extension all the time. So when she was put in this overarch position, all of a sudden her core isn't firing very well. Her glutes aren't firing at all because of the way her hips are positioned. Covered that last week. And finally, the lower back has to absorb all this extra tension that the glutes and the core itself should be absorbing. So instead, our vertebrae are getting a bunch of shearing forces and compression forces that are, for Marissa, resulting in degenerative disc disease, and so many of other clients have had the same issues. So hence why anti-extensions are a great exercise to do, and how, for Marissa, it really retrained her core how to functionally say, oh, maybe I shouldn't be going into this arched extended position all the time. Maybe I should keep this a little bit more stable on a functional basis. Now, Our next two exercises, one is going to be a little bit more advanced. I'm not going to go into tons of detail with this one because it's a little bit more explosive and dynamic, and often when you kind of get into more fast twitch stuff, we want to have somebody that's either watching you through like a video chat or somebody that is actually with you in person to monitor your form. But a great exercise nonetheless is medicine ball slams. And a medicine ball slam is an exercise where you're taking a ball of some kind and you're slamming it straight down. The thing that we want to focus on when we're doing this slam is, again, keeping that core nice and stable as we're coming down, as opposed to flexing at the lower back and going into that spinal flexion. We're trying to keep this stable. So we want the momentum to come from the shoulders and to come from the hips as we're slamming down. And you can do slams in a lot of different positions. You could do this off to the side in a staggered stance. You could do this side to side in a neutral stance. You can do it from a squat to slam. You could do it from a lunge to slam. There's all kinds of different ways of changing it up, but it's very functional, very explosive, and very dynamic movement, and a great exercise nonetheless if you have really good core stability and you feel confident in your form with it. And the last one, how could we oh, actually, I take it back. We have two more. This next one, we couldn't obviously forget. It would be planks. Planks are a great exercise, and there's a million different kinds. We could spend an hour just talking about plank variations right now. So instead, I kind of want to go over a few of the main rules with planks because they are that functional with us. They are training our core to stay completely stable in a position, just like we want it to stay stable in a position when we are picking something up, when we're squatting, when we're lunging, when we're running, all of the above. We want this core to stay stable, and we want the rest of the body to get our movement patterns. So this was integrated all throughout Marissa's program. This was also really key in Brandon's program. For those of you who remember Brandon, who got a full ride scholarship to play college football for Marshall, he was having these imbalances all around his hips, and he was doing tons and tons of leg lift exercises. We're going to cover that in a second. But he was doing tons and tons of core leg lift exercise to try to get his lower abs. He was also trying to go more low impact. He was having issues with his hamstrings and his back. And when we said, look, let's ease up on those leg lifts. Let's instead train your core functionally through a series of different types of planks from different angles to work the transverse abdominis and your obliques and all your stabilizers in different ways. It was one of the big things that adjusted the way his hips functioned and the way his core activated when he was playing his sport. That kept him off of the sidelines because he was no longer injured, and hence why he was offered his scholarship. So going into the plank itself can be done, well, like I said, a million different ways, but often it's going to be done off your elbows or off your hands. And when it's on your elbows, the rule of thumb is that we want to avoid our hands coming together. We do not want this angle inward at our forearms. That's the number one issue that I see with most people when they do planks, is they do this position. And if you had to take an educated guess as you guys are sitting and watching this, why do you think that's the case? I'll cover it in a second, but I want you to brainstorm. What do you think activates when your arms go into this position that probably is a little bit already overactivated on you? So I'll touch on that in 1 second. You guys can brainstorm it. But for right now, instead, what we want to do is get one, the arms neutral, and two, I'm going to rotate my palms up so that they're facing the sky as I'm holding my plank position. What this is going to enable me to do a lot easier is to get my shoulders pinched down and back into a neutral position as opposed to rolled forward and slouched forward at the shoulders. And that's the reason why we don't want to be angled in, because when we angle in, this answer to the question is, we go into internal rotation at the shoulder. It's very easy to round our shoulders when our hands are together in a plank, but when we put our palms up and we get them parallel, now it's much more natural for us to have a good neutral position at the shoulder girdle as we hold this plank. So that external rotation is what helps our shoulders get into position. The same thing applies to when we do a plank off of your hands. We want to not just put our hands on the ground and get into a plank, we want to put some external rotation into the ground to help our shoulders get into position. So how you can easily tell if you're doing it the right way is when you hold your normal plank, if you look at your elbow pits themselves, you're going to probably notice that they're facing each other. Instead, when you put a little bit of external rotation into the ground, you're going to see that these things start pointing upward. So instead of having my elbows facing each other, now all of a sudden as I screw into the ground, my elbows are facing above my head. And again, as soon as I am screwing my hands into the ground, it makes it much easier for me to pinch my shoulders down and back and get into a great neutral position. So whether you're on your hands or whether you're on your elbows, that external position is very key to get the shoulder girdle in a neutral position so that we're not overactivating those internal rotators while we stabilize that core. Now, the last little variation that I really like is probably one of my favorite variations of a plank. It's called a plank to squeeze. And a plank to squeeze is done off of your elbows typically, and instead of having your tension kind of going upward into the ground, what we're going to do is cause our body to pull those elbows down toward our toes and engage our back muscles a little bit more, which are going to pull on our core because your back muscles run into your entire core. It's going to engage it that much more. So if I was holding a normal plank, right now my tension in the floor is going upward. Instead, I'm going to reverse it and pull my elbows down toward my toes and keep this constant tension down the entire time. What I want to make sure is that my hips themselves don't move at all as I'm doing this squeeze. So what I don't want to see happen is as I start this pull for my body and shoulders to move upright, I want to be staying back over my elbows the whole time, and I don't want my hips to dip down to the ground. So again, we're fighting that extension in the lower back and keeping them neutral the entire time. So those are a few different variations of planks that I love. That plank to squeeze is a very challenging version of the plank. So most of you can probably hold a plank for 30 seconds, 60 seconds, even 2 minutes or longer. But that plank to squeeze is going to make it 5 times harder, maybe more. So how I started off like Brandon with this, and how we started off Marissa with this, and how we started off so many of our other clients is we do it in 5-second stints. So someone will pop up, squeeze as hard as they can for 5 seconds, and then ease up out of it, give themselves a break for 5 seconds, and then pop back up. So they can go in and out of sets of this, and then when that gets easier, they can do it for 10-second stints. Then they can do it for 20-second stints, and they can kind of up it by 5 to 10 seconds at a time. So that is my primary suggestion on how to kind of ramp up those plank to squeezes as they get so much more challenging than a regular plank. Now, our last kind of key exercise is not one of my main go-tos, but in terms of sit-ups and crunches, this is one of the best patterns you can do. It's a straight leg sit-up. So a straight leg sit-up can be done with your legs out to the sides a little bit, or with your legs straight ahead. Either is totally fine. The legs out to the sides is a little bit easier because most people can have an easier time sitting upright. And this can be done body weight or with weight, where body weight, we would just have our arms straight up and down, or with weight, we could be holding onto a dumbbell here, holding onto a dumbbell with both arms, or a medicine ball, anything like that. Any kind of weight you can be holding in one arm or both arms. The main key is that we're going to try to go for a full sit-up, and as we get to the top, we're going to extend our arms overhead and straighten out our back like someone was pulling a string that was connected to our head up toward the sky. So we're trying to get tall at the spine and then come back down. You don't have to hold it for a ton of time, just a quick second, and then positioning yourself back down. Or if you were with one arm, you'd come up, bring it all the way up, and then come back down to that neutral position. So we're starting with your arms dead over your chest each rep. We're not starting overhead to get more momentum to perk us up. We're trying to start from a dead position, come all the way up, completely vertical, straightening out that spine, and then back down. I like this version of a sit-up because it's much more functional to how we are actually sitting, like laying down and getting up throughout the day, and because we're ending in that full, straight, perfect postural position, as opposed to most sit-ups where we're going to be flexing and crunching down, rounding the back the whole time. So we are ending in a good position, hence why I like this version. So these are the exercises that we typically want to be doing about 2/3 of our time. So 60-70% of your choices should kind of pertain to this list. Now, the other exercises that aren't necessarily bad for you, but we don't want to put quite as much emphasis in it, is one, crunches. Crunches, I don't want to say are a terrible exercise. They're not. And there's a lot of variations to them, and they're a great way of like getting a good burn for your actual rectus abdominis, the six-pack. If you want to like get that aesthetics, it's a good way of working out that particular muscle group. With regards to its functionality for us though, like we've kind of already established, this spinal flexion isn't very functional for how we do anything in our lives, whether we're running, whether we're throwing, whether we're picking things up, whether we are sitting in the car. We don't want that position to translate, right? So there is, though, one thing that can make a crunch a bit more beneficial. And actually, I'll do it off of the Bosu ball instead of the ground because it's a little bit easier to see. It is using your crunch as an anti-extension. So as opposed to focusing on the upward position, which most people are just trying to focus on getting up, getting up, getting up. Instead, we're gonna try to slow it down on the way down, which is going to work us into anti-extension for that lower back. So you don't have to go quite as slow as I just did, but having your emphasis be more on the way down is going to get you a lot more benefits to this on a functional way with your core activating, and believe it or not, it's going to burn out your abs a lot more. So you're going to get 2 for 1 there. It's going to be a more effective workout, and it's going to be a little bit more functional, especially for those of you that are dealing with some back pains. So with regards to crunches, that would be my recommendation. You can incorporate lots of variations, whether it's on the ground, on a Bosu ball, or on a stability ball, and tons of other variations. I would recommend, often I see people intertwining their hands behind the back of their head, and that causes them to want to pull their head up as they come up. I would encourage you to instead put your hands at your ears, open up your elbows, and try to only lift your entire chest as one unit, as opposed to shrugging or bringing your arms forward. Because again, kind of like how we're trying to avoid that internal position in our plank, we don't want to be pulling on our neck and causing more internal rotation at the shoulder girdle while we do crunches. Next one is bent knee sit-ups. We kind of already went into this. The reason why we don't like the bent knee version and standard version of sit-ups is because of that tendency to coming up in that rounded position. So tend to do those a little bit more sporadically, I would say. Then leg lifts and mountain climbers. Okay, so leg lifts and mountain climbers are probably the most common exercise that I tell our clients to stop doing. Marissa is no longer allowed to do leg lifts or mountain climbers. Brandon is no longer allowed to do leg lifts. We already touched on Brandon and his leg lifts a little bit because he had such overactive hip flexors, just like Marissa does, just like so many of us do, because we spend so many hours sitting and then running, or then on a bike, or then in the car, whatever it might be. We lock these guys up and activate them so much that we have this anterior pelvic tilt. So for Brandon, it was causing a lot of tension in his hamstrings. If you guys have a ton of tightness in your hamstrings, that very well could be stemming from your hips being pulled out of placement, not necessarily an issue with the hamstrings themselves. So for Brandon, he kept stretching out his hamstrings, trying to improve them. Well, it turned out it was actually because of all the activation he was doing in his hip flexors and shortening that he was doing in his hip flexors that were pulling his hips out of alignment, that were pulling on his hamstrings. So it wasn't a lack of actual flexibility in his hamstrings that was his issue. It was a lack of flexibility and mobility in his hip flexors themselves. So we stopped him from doing that. Same thing went for Marissa. She was spending far too much time already knee driving while she was biking and while she was running. She didn't need to get any more leg lifts in there. So hence why Pilates with its leg lifts and pikes and V holds, where you're kind of holding yourself in this position for a while, which is very hip flexor dominant, or our leg lifts where we're extending up, or variations with like butterfly kicks, or overhead leg lift positions, or hanging leg lifts where you're on a bar or you're hanging from something. All of those things are primary hip flexor dominant exercises. They do engage your core a little bit, but it's mostly your hip flexors. So I would do this exercise very sparingly, especially if you have lower back pain. I would consider avoiding it altogether. And the same thing goes for mountain climbers. For those of you that go to boot camp classes, they are a go-to for getting your heart rate up. it's a plank position, which is a good thing, but it's a ton of knee driving and hip flexion the entire time. So we're gonna get, again, overactive here. So instead, an alternative would be, one, get into your good kind of screw-in position in that plank, and you can either just hold that plank while the rest are doing mountain climbers, or you can do heel kicks up into the air where you're activating your glutes more as opposed to activating your hip flexor. So that's an alternative that you can just use to swap out. And then we've already touched on it, is pikes. Pikes can be done with your feet on a TRX. They could be done with your feet on a stability ball. It could be done with your feet on gliders and on a slide board. But a piking motion is essentially in that plank position, and you're sliding your feet up and then sliding your feet back down. Now I'm obviously walking them up and down, but it would be much smoother in sliding up and down, kind of like how we talked about the ab wheel. That motion is, again, very aggressive on the hip flexors. It does engage the core. It is functional in terms of, as you're going down, if you control this motion going down, you are controlling yourself into anti-extension. So you're controlling your body from allowing it to arch at that lower back. So it does have some functional purposes to it. It's just very hip flexor dominant. So we don't want to have it be our main go-to all the time, but something that we incorporate about 1/3 of the time we're working out our core. And guys, that is our kind of overview for what exercises we want to be prioritizing. We want to train this core how to stay stable, functional, in all of the activities that we're doing, and we want to kind of do it in a way that isn't going to overactivate the areas that tend to already be very overdominant and pulling us out of alignment. So our chopping variations, our anti-rotations, our anti-extensions, our planking variations, all those things are really, really good things that we want to do consistently, versus our other exercises aren't necessarily bad, but we just want to do them a little bit more sporadically. So guys, if you haven't already, download that ebook. Next week we're going to be covering upper body and full body exercises, summing up this whole functional workout topic. And as well, at this point, if you guys want some one-on-one help, if you want to have a game plan on how you can actually balance out your body like Marissa did, we gave her a full functional program that wasn't just about her core, it was about everything from head to toe to get her body sound and in alignment, and she was able to do it in just 15 to 20 minutes a day. Or how Brandon was able to go from being on the verge of being third string on the depth chart and missing his opportunity to continue to play football, to starting and gaining a full ride scholarship for with the same amount of time, 15 to 20 minutes a day, and balancing out his body through the right stretches and not releasing techniques and exercises like we're talking about today, then we'd love to connect with you. We have what we call a free mobility call, where you get to connect with us over a free call, where we're going to talk to you about what your functional health history is, what your functional health goals are going forward, and actually create a game plan with you on your next steps on how you can get to those goals. So click on our calendar link just below this video. We'll attach it also in the show notes, but we'd love to connect with you and give you some free one-on-one help. Outside of that, guys, hope you have a great rest of your day, and we'll talk to you soon.